Welcome to the Crafted Closet. In this video, I'm going to show you the making of my daughter's Easter dress. A little heads up, I had broken my wrist 2.5 weeks before I decided to make this dress. Had surgery 2 weeks beforehand, so I struggle a little bit with the fact that I had a broken left wrist in this video. Here is the dress. Oh, that's the back of the dress. Here's the front of the dress. This is the Peony Patterns Lily dress, and it has the ruffle. In the video, I show you how I French seam the ruffle fabric, and all of the seams inside are fully enclosed. Fabric is from Hobby Lobby, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and like the video. Feel free to leave a comment. Let me know something that you would like to see in the future, or just whatever. And one detail, if I were going to make this dress again, I would interface the waistband. You can just kind of see the fabric through it, and I feel like it would benefit from being lightly interfaced. So if you make this dress, I would suggest interfacing that. But other than that, it turned out really cute, and I was really happy with it. So let's get into it. I am sewing the waistband seams together. And then this is going to be a neckband ruffle, so I'm just going to turn the fabric right sides together and sew a little 1/2-inch seam at the edge. I'll do that on both sides. And then this is the waistband ruffle, and I'm sewing 1/2-inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to sew the shoulder seams of the bodice. And I'm back stitching on the area where it's actually going to be inside of the dress seam instead of at the outside edge, so that there's a little more support where there's actually where there will actually be tension on the fabric in the final garment. And then this is the lining. And I'm going to do the same thing on the lining. I'm going to press all the seams that we just sewed for the neckband ruffle. I don't trim this corner. I leave it intact, and then I just push the corner out. And I still get a nice sharp corner with less chance of that corner coming undone and fraying. For the waistband, I'm going to press these seams open. So I'll press them to one side first. And open it up. This is the waistband ruffle. I'm gonna just press that seam open. And then I will fold this piece of fabric in half and press all the way across. And then for the puppy in the background, for the bodice shoulders, I like to press the mane towards the back of the bodice. And then the lining, I will press towards the front of the bodice. And I've started doing this way because I have seen a little bit of pulling at the seam on previous garments. And this way, it's kind of a quilting trick. You can nest the seams together, and having the seam all pressed one direction just seems to make it a little bit stronger. But it ends up with the same amount of fabric at that seam with either way, whether you press it open or if you press it to one side. My next step is to sew gathering stitches on all of the ruffles. So there's 2 cap sleeve ruffles, a neckband ruffle, and a waist ruffle. And I'm going to change my stitch length to a 4 on my machine. And I'm going to do the first. I like to put my needle down and put the fabric right against it. And I'm going to do my first row at 5 millimeters, or it's about 3/16 of an inch. I have a nice amount of tails at the end. When I get to the end of that piece, I'm going to pull out a nice little bit of tail and just put the next piece in. Again, I'll leave a long tail, and then I'll go back to the beginning and sew a second line of stitching for each one at a centimeter or just under 1/2 inch. Next, we're going to work on the cap sleeve ruffle. I've got one of the little ruffles that we've done the gathering stitches on, and I'm going to cut a little notch at the halfway point on that, and then also on the cap sleeve. So we're going to attach the ruffle to the flatter side of the cap sleeve. So I'm also going to mark the midpoint of that. So now we're going to gather the fabric. I'm going to take the 2 threads from one side and pull them. Gather this up so that it's the same length as the cap sleeve. Okay, so I've actually got this a little bit shorter, but that's okay. I start in the middle. I find my little notch mark. Maybe make your notch a little larger. And I pin that in place. And then I'll come down to the end and pull out a little bit of those gathers. At the end, we want to leave 1/2 inch ungathered because that's going to end up in our seam allowance. And then I'll just spread the rest of the gathers evenly between those 2 points. Then I'll do the same for the other side. Now I have this all evenly gathered. I'm going to quickly baste this in place. I'm going to switch my stitch length back to a just under 2.5, and then I'm going to baste in at 1 centimeter because our final seam allowance is 1/2 inch. I just like to do it this way so that I can see the ruffles as I sew them on, and I make sure nothing's getting caught or pleated that I don't want. I can also kind of adjust ruffles as I go. I'm going to take out my pins. And then I'm going to take the lining piece and line it up with the seam or the edge. And sew this at 1/2 inch. What that'll look like. I'll trim off any little loose threads like this. I'm also going to trim the seam allowance down. You don't want all that bulk in the sleeve. So I'll press this open, and you could top stitch this. I think I'm going to leave it. I'm going to press it and decide whether or not I want to top stitch. Now we're going to sew the neck ruffle onto the bodice. I've done the same thing as I did with the cap sleeve. I gathered the ruffle up. I had cut notches at the halfway point and then at the quarter points. And the quarter points match up with the shoulder seams. And then at the back, I've left just over 1/2 inch so that when we sew this seam, we don't catch the neck ruffle. So I'm going to baste it into place at 1 centimeter. Now I'm going to take the lining, and with right sides together, I'm going to pin it in place. I'm going to start by lining up the shoulder seams. Now that I have that all pinned, I'm going to sew it in place. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Normally I would sew on a dress that has a button back, I would sew this seam closed at this point too, but because this dress has a waistband detail that we need to work on, I'm going to leave this seam open for now. So I will just sew the neckline. I'm going to leave this corner as it is, but I'm going to trim down to just about 3/16 of an inch, a little more than 1/8 of an inch. Normally I would pink the neckline, but because of the ruffle, I'm not going to. And then here's where broken wrist is making things a little more difficult for me than normal because I can't rotate the wrist the way that I normally would. And again, I'm going to leave a little bit at the center back seam. Now I'm going to open up the seam and understitch to help the ruffle stand up. You can also understitch really any bodice. It's not a bad thing to do. It helps keep the lining from sticking out at the front of the dress, or at the neckline of the dress. So I'm just going to line up the edge of my presser foot with the seam between the ruffle and the lining, and just sew along, and I'm going to pull it open as I sew. And I'm sewing all of the seam allowance. So for the mane, the ruffle, and the lining to the lining. What the understitching looks like. Now I'll take this over to the ironing board and iron the main bodice out, and if I have any gathering stitches that are still showing on the front, I will pull those out. So now we're going to work on inserting this cap sleeves. I've decided not to top stitch them. I'm just going to leave them as is. I'm going to fold it in half and mark the center point. And the center point is going to line up with the shoulder seam. And I'm also going to trim the edge of the ruffle so that it matches up with the edge of the sleeve. Get all those extra threads off. And I've got my bodice. Front's here, back's here. I'm going to line up my center notch, and I'm just getting the front. I'm not catching the lining as I pin this in. You could run a little gathering stitch here just to help you ease the sleeve in, but I'm just going to kind of ease it in. Now that I have that pinned in, I'm going to baste it in place. Make sure to keep the lining out of the way while we do this. I just want to make sure I'm not getting any little pleats sewn in there. I'm just making sure everything that's actually going through the presser foot is nice and flat. check my work and make sure that there's no little tucks or anything sewn in. And now we're going to roll all of this in between the lining and the main. And you can only do this technique if you have a dress that has a front or back opening. If it doesn't have an opening at the front or back, you're not going to be able to pull all of the fabric through the shoulder. So if you don't have a front or back opening, you would have to use the burrito roll. And this also only works if you have a sleeveless dress or something with a cap sleeve, something that doesn't have a underarm seam. If you have an underarm seam and you want to have this fully finished lining and have all the seams enclosed, I have a video that you can go watch that shows how to do that. But again, that video requires that you have a front or back opening. Otherwise, the entire bodice would have to be rolled up into the shoulder seam. And that might get a little tight. Okay, so I've got that all pinned together. And I'm going to go from the top side again, just so I can see my previous stitch line and make sure that I get that. I'm sewing to the left of that stitch line. So now I'm sewing at 1/2 inch. And it doesn't really matter what's happening over here. You just want to make sure that what's going through the presser foot and under the needle is nice and flat. You want to make sure that the sleeve, you're not going to catch any of the sleeve or get it folded up in there. Got to make sure that that's getting pinned out of the way as you pin the lining and the main together. Remove any of the pins that I sewed over. Sewing over pins is kind of a no-no. I do it anyway. It's probably best practices not to do that. And now I'm going to come with my pinking shears and trim up the seam. Because it's curved, you want to allow for the, basically you want to clip the curve so that it will lay flat. And when you're going over multiple layers with pinking shears, it can be a little difficult. And with a broken hand, it can be even more difficult. There we go. You want to make sure you're not actually cutting your stitching line. You want to cut, I cut a little bit away from it, probably less than 1/8 of an inch away for where the point of the triangle is, but you don't want to cut through the stitching line because then you'll have a seam that's not secure. I'm not catching any of my lining. If you don't have pinking shears, you can just cut notches. Okay, so now we have all of that cut, and we're going to open the front bodice, find our little sleeve, and start pulling this through. Carefully, because you don't want to rip the seams you've just sewn. So just gently, go slowly. Sleeve. Let's see if I can get it all in. Is there, and on the inside that is fully finished and there's no exposed seams. So I will do this on the other side and then we'll work on the waist seam. So now I have both sleeves in. We're going to close up the side seam. So I'm going to open up the front and match it up with the back. I'm going to come to the seam under the armpit and line that up. Pin. And then the rest I'll just hold in place at the machine. After sewing the side seams, I've pressed them open and then folded them over, given the underarm a nice press. And now we're going to do the waistband ruffle. To work on the waistband ruffle, I've folded it in half and I'm going to clip a notch at the center. And then I'm going to fold that and meet up with the side seam and clip 2 notches at the quarter marks. I'm doing this to get some registration points so that I can evenly spread the ruffle. And then on the back, I'm gonna put the end 1/2 inch past the center seam, and I will clip a notch in there. I'll do that on the other side, and then I'm going to gather this up so that it's even with the length of the waist. And on the front of the bodice, I'm also going to clip those same registration points. So I'll have the side seam match, and I'll cut a halfway point, and then I'll meet the side seam to that middle point and cut a notch 1/4 of the way across the bodice. And then on the back, again, I'll put it 1/2 inch past that side seam and I'll put a notch there. So I've gathered up my ruffle and I've placed pins at each of my little notch marks, which I don't think you can see on there, but now I'm going to line up the notch marks on the gather with the notch marks on the bodice and pin that in place all along the seam. So I just move the gathers over so that I can get everything lined up. And then between the pins, I spread the gathers nice and evenly. And I'll add a couple more pins between each of the registration marks. So I'll do that along the entire bodice. So now I have all of the ruffle gathered in. I've left 1/2 inch at this back seam on both ends ungathered because that is going to end up being in the finished center back seam at the end. And then I also want to just comment on why this is this fabric and not the little blue chambray. So the waistband is going to be out of this little chambray dot, but I want this little ruffle to look like it's part of the skirt and that the chambray waistband is just covering all this gathering from the ruffle up here and then from the skirt down there, and like it's just a band over top of all this area so that this looks like it's part of the skirt even though it's technically just a ruffle. So I'm going to sew this in place. Actually, I'm going to, again, just baste this in place because then I'll sew this at the 1/2 inch seam allowance when I add the waistband. So right now I'm just sewing at 1 centimeter, which in imperial terms is 3/8 of an inch. I'll try and be good and take out my pins. And again, I like sewing with the gathers up so that if I need to, I can adjust them as I go. The waistband. So I'm going to line up my seams. Okay, I've got that all pinned in. So now I'm going to sew at 1/2 inch. This sewn in, I'm going to trim the seam allowance by a little more than 1/2, and then I'm going to top stitch this down. So I started top stitching with white thread and I just don't like how that looks, so I'm going to rip that out and put a blue in so that I can have that match a little bit. I pulled up that white top stitching. I've changed my needle thread to a blue. And I'm going to also change my stitch length to a 3 because I didn't like how small those stitches were. So now I've got the edge, the left edge of the waistband lined up with the left edge of my 1/8 inch presser foot. And I'm just going along and making sure that the seam allowance for the ruffles and the waistband are all underneath where I'm stitching. Then I'm gonna go iron this into place. So here's our finished bodice. I think it's looking adorable so far. I'm super excited about this. And then just to show you the inside, need to clean up all the seams are fully finished. There's no exposed seams, which is like my favorite thing ever. So obviously that's not a requirement for sewing. You can definitely use a serger and finish seams, but I love fully enclosed seams. So there's the back. So now we're going to work on the skirt pocket, and I am going to do this in a separate video, but I show how to French seam a pocket and the side seam so that this is all fully enclosed in the skirt. But I wanted that to be a standalone video, so that will be linked in the description below. Anyway, for the placket, I found the center back of the skirt and cut a slit 3 inches long. And then my placket is 8 inches by 2.5 inches. And I'm just going to basically find the center of my placket. Mark that with a pin. Open it up. And then this is the way I like to do plackets, but you can, there's multiple different ways if you search it on YouTube. I'm sure you will find. At the center of the crease, I just like to have a tiny bit that's going to get caught by the needle. And then at the ends, I will sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. And then you just end up with a tiny little tuck at the center back of that placket that on a gathered skirt isn't really even noticeable. I'm going to sew at a 1/4 inch. I'm just trying to get this to lay fairly flat here. Sewing down, and for the center I want to make sure that I'm catching it with the needle, but I don't want very much of that to be, I just want to catch the tiniest bit of it. So that's what that looks like. And then I'm going to press this over. Well, I'll show you at the ironing. Okay, so here's my placket so far. I'm going to flip this out and iron the seam into the placket. And then I'm going to iron this edge over 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to fold this in half so that that edge I just ironed lines up with my stitches that I just did. Then we'll take this back over to the machine and stitch just down there. So now we're going to top stitch this in place. And as I go along, I'm going to make sure it's lining up with the stitches that I previously sewed. Like that. We're going to fold it so that the top edge of the skirt meets up, and then we'll just sew a 45-degree diagonal right here. And that just holds that closed when the wearer is wearing it. And that's how it'll look when it gets attached into the skirt. One last thing, we're going to just trim off any excess here. There's the finished placket. I am adding a ruffle to the bottom of this skirt, so I'm going to assemble that now. My ruffle is 4 times the width of fabric, so I'm going to French seam those pieces together. So I'm going to start with wrong sides together. So you'll do that for all 4 seams, and then trim the seam by half. And I'm just gonna finger press this at the machine. You can definitely go iron this open too. But I'm just gonna open it up like that. Fold it over, make sure it's all pressed out to the side, and then so that just a minute, bud. And there's a finished French seam, so do that on the other 3. Now that I have all 4 French seams done, I've pressed them all to what will be the right side of the wearer. And I'm going to do the hem now. I'm just going to fold over 1/4 of an inch and another 1/4 of an inch. I'm also going to switch my stitch length to a 3 because this is going to be top stitching from the other side. And I'm going to line my foot up with the left side of the hem. And then when you get to these French seams, that's a little bulky. Just be very slow and careful going over them. And I'll do this all the way around the nearly 5 yards of ruffle. And back stitch to finish. There's the completed hem. And now I'm running gathering stitches along the entire thing. I'm going to start at one of the seams. I'm going to make sure I have tails. I'm going to up my stitch length to a 4. I'm going to do my first one at 3/16 of an inch or 5 millimeters. And I'm going to stop this stitch right before I get back to my starting point. One more. Then I'll pull out tails. And then I'll run a second line of gathering stitches at 1 centimeter. And I'm starting at the exact same point that I did for the first line because you really want those stitches to line up with each other so that you get nice, clean gathers. Again, making sure I'm not catching the gathering stitches where I started. And pull that out. Before I gather this up, I'm going to mark the halfway point of each of these panels. So I'll line up the side seams, pull it out straight, and clip a little notch in there. So I'll do that for all 4 panels. Yeah, there you can see. Now I have my ruffle gathered and I have my main skirt piece. I'm going to line up the side seams of the skirt piece and mark the center of the bottom. And then I will fold the center to meet up with the side seams and mark the quarter points. And I'll do that on the front and back. And then I'm going to start, where did I just mark that? There we go. There's my quarter point. So I'm going to start at the, on this end I've got where I pulled the gathering threads. I'm going to go to the other end, to the middle seam, and I'm going to line up that seam with one of the quarter points on my skirt, because I don't want the seams to be in the center, front and back of the skirt. I want them to be off to the side. So if we line up the seams of the ruffle with the quarters on the skirt, then it will be, those seams will be to the side and won't be as noticeable. So I'm going to line that up, and we're going to French seam this ruffle in, so I'm putting it in with the wrong sides together to begin. And I'll find my quarter mark, and I'll line that up with the side seam. And then I will spread my gathers evenly between those points. And I'll work this all the way around until I get to where I started my gather threads and get it all pinned on. So it's going to take a while. I'll meet you at the sewing machine. I now have the entire ruffle pinned into the skirt, and I'm going to sew the first line of the French seam. So everything is pinned wrong sides together, and I'm starting where the gathering stitches start, and I have them out of the way and down inside because I don't want to cut them off when I trim the seam allowance. I'm going to sew at 3/16 of an inch. And I sew with my gathers up so that I can move them around as needed. So I'll go all the way around. Now that I've finished sewing that first line of stitching, I will go and trim all the way around, just so that there's about 1/8 of an inch left, and I cut off all the little loose threads that are hanging. Now that all of that is trimmed, and I've made sure to leave the gathering threads on both sides intact so that that gathering stitch stays in place, I'm going to iron the seam open. And if you pull the gathers out like this, you kind of iron them in place. And remove as many little threads as you can as you iron. And then after I do that all the way around, I will flip it and come back and press that crease in. So that the main skirt and ruffle are right sides together And then at the sewing machine, I'll sew along that stitch line at 1/4 inch, and that'll create the French seam for the ruffle. Now that that's all pressed into place, I will just sew at 1/4 inch with the gathers up again. You could go through and pin all of this, but I just like to kind of make sure everything's in place as I go. I pull the gathers out to the left and hold the seam with my right hand. So there's the French seamed ruffle. At the ironing board, I will press that up towards the main skirt. And now I'm going to sew gathering stitches along the waist seam of the skirt. So I'm going to get bobbin thread up, make sure I have some tails, switch this back to a 4-length stitch, and I'm going to start my stitch right past the placket. And again, I'll do it at 3/16 of an inch and then a centimeter. Before attaching the skirt, I'm going to sew the buttonholes, and I've marked a hole that's going to be at the midpoint of the waistband and 1/2 inch from the edge. And then I marked one that's 1/2 inch from the top corner, both down and in. And then I split the difference between those 2 points to find these middle 2 buttons. And if you're sewing a smaller bodice, you might want to only have 3 buttons on the back, because it's just not necessary to have as many. And for back bodices, I always sew my buttonholes horizontal on the bodice. So I'm going to have a separate machine basically just for buttonholes, so I'll line that up and sew the buttonhole. So I have my first buttonhole lined up, and I'm going to hit the start stop button. And I will do the other 4 buttonholes, or the other 3 buttonholes the same way. Gathered and pinned the skirt to the bodice, and just like every other time I've done gathering, I've marked little registration marks around the bodice and the skirt so that I can evenly spread the gathers. This is the important part for the placket. On the side that's going to have the buttons, the placket needs to lay flat against the bodice. On the side that has the buttonholes, which in this case is the left side of the bodice, I've gathered the skirt all the way to the edge of the bodice and then folded the placket back over the skirt gathers. Then we'll sew it in place, and because we've done the buttonholes first, this first little section is going to be a little tight, but I didn't want to have to sew the buttonholes that close to the top of the skirt, so I chose to do it that way. So get this in, make sure that I'm not catching any of the lining, and we will sew the skirt on. Again, gathers up at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Oh, and I have no thread in my needle. Let me rethread and then we'll sew it. And as you come to the end and you're sewing this placket piece down, make sure that you're not catching the lining. Now the skirt's attached to the bodice, and the only thing left to do is attach the lining and sew on the buttons. To sew the lining in place, I'm going to pin it first. So I'm going to come to the side where the placket is, fold the lining over by 1/2 inch, and then fold it to cover these inside raw edges, and then I will pin in place from the inside. Then next I will come over to the underarm seam, fold under 1/2 inch, and line up my underarm seam with the side seam of the skirt and pin that in place. Then in between, I will again make sure I'm folding under 1/2 inch and just, let's see. So there's the line of stitching. I want to make sure that I'm covering that line of stitching, and I will pin it in place. And I will pin in place about every inch along the seam line. And you want to make sure that you don't pull the lining too tight, because it will cause the main bodice fabric to bubble, but you also don't want it to be too loose, because then it will cause wrinkling behind the main bodice. And you also, on this one, it's not as big a deal, but if you don't have any gathering at the, you don't have this neckline ruffle, if you don't have it tight enough, it will pop up from the top of the bodice. So you want to make sure that you get it in there. So I will go around the entire bodice and pin this in place. I now have the lining pinned in all the way around. I've put the dress on my machine face up, and I'm going to sew a top stitch along this waist seam. I have switched my top stitch thread to blue. I'm going to put my needle down, bump my dress right up against that edge, and I have the right side of the waistband lining up with the right side of the presser foot. I'm just going to slowly go all the way around. You can pull the pins out from underneath as you go. I'm going to make sure that this is all laying nice and flat as it goes under the needle. Finish by just sewing off, and then I will leave some tails so that I can tie off and bury those threads, because I don't like the look of back stitching on top stitching. From the inside, the lining has all been caught. And from the outside, you have nice matching rows of top stitching. And here is the completed dress. If you've enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. And thank you for watching The Crafted Closet.